Are you prepared for a tale that'll be the talk of your circle for weeks? Make sure your coffee stays hot, because things are just starting to heat up. Believe me, when you hear about how one ridiculously nosy HOA troublemaker managed to flip a perfectly peaceful day on my family farm upside down, you'll hardly believe it. So let me tell you exactly how Karen ended up calling 911 from my own land, clueless that the police were already here, waiting just for her. I live on this beautiful, peaceful 40-acre farm that's been handed down for generations in my family. My folks settled here back in the 60s, an era when nobody gave a hoot if your front yard had heirloom tomatoes or if your barn paint was peeling a bit. Over the years, farmland all around the county has gradually vanished, replaced by rows and rows of identical, picture-perfect neighborhoods. The newest development in our area is this enormous housing complex that's infamous for having an HOA with unbelievably strict guidelines. I'm talking serious rules here. Everything from the shade of your hydrangeas to the exact height of your grass is strictly controlled. The central character of this story, who we'll call Karen, proudly appointed herself as the neighborhood watchdog for every HOA rule imaginable. Karen basically lived glued to her binoculars, constantly keeping an eagle eye on me as if I was on America's Most Wanted list. She never missed a chance to make some snarky remark about the so-called disorderly farm next door. Never mind that my great-granddad's orchard had been there long before her brand-new house was even a blueprint. To her, my orchard was nothing but an ugly nuisance. Her constant nitpicking eventually went from mildly annoying drits to an all-out flood of hostility. The evening before her infamous call to 911, I caught her pacing anxiously along our shared property line, jotting down notes like some detective on a stakeout. You might be wondering what's got Karen so worked up. Well, the simple truth is, my farm isn't under any HOA jurisdiction because we're not part of their subdivision. I don't have to follow their silly paint schemes or meticulous regulations. This fact absolutely drives Karen insane, especially whenever she sees me repainting my barns or planting different crops close to her yard. She behaved like my goat's bleating was a direct insult, and often complained my rooster's morning crow ruined her precious beauty rest. So naturally, she fought back with the only thing she knew how to do, constant whining. Normally, I let her petty threats and complaints roll off my back. But that all changed 2 days ago when she stormed up to me waving some cease and desist notice about supposed odors coming from my compost pile. Honestly, I bet she doesn't even know what composting really means. She probably assumed it violated some code or another. And to top it off, she threatened me, saying I'd soon hear from the authorities. I calmly offered to give her a personal farm tour so she could see our environmentally friendly compost operation firsthand, but she flatly declined. We have standards, she snapped, before marching off, her heels clicking like the banging of a judge's gavel. Honestly, never in my wildest dreams did I imagine she'd involve the police over something as innocent as compost. Yet that's exactly what happened. There I was, inspecting the fence line near our orchard, when Karen suddenly sprang up from behind the perfectly groomed hedge between our properties. She jabbed a finger in my direction, accused my donkey's braying of being intentional harassment, and shouted she'd had enough. "You'll be hearing from the sheriff," she hollered. But what she didn't realize was that the local authorities were already planning to visit the very next day. Not for me, mind you. That's for her. You see, Karen wasn't just an annoying neighbor. She'd been secretly dumping yard waste and fertilizer runoff into the creek behind both our properties. That creek feeds my farm's irrigation, and last month, I started noticing the water looking a bit strange. Turns out other neighbors upstream had also reported similar water problems. The Department of Environmental Conservation got involved, along with the sheriff's office. So while Karen was busy spying and taking notes on my imagined offenses, the real authorities were quietly gathering evidence against her. Anyway, the next morning came bright and breezy. As usual, I was up before sunrise, tending to the chickens, feeding the goats, and patting Peanut, my faithful donkey, on the head. Off in the distance, I could hear Karen impatiently revving the engine of her SUV. I glanced down at my watch. It was 6:45 a.m. Probably she was on her way to another HOA meeting to gripe about my farm, desperately hoping the board would somehow annex my land into their control. Meanwhile, I had an appointment that actually mattered. Deputy Carter was scheduled to drop by at 8 a.m. for a water sample. When he arrived, the sun had barely begun to rise, just peeking over the horizon. We chatted briefly about the water testing, and he mentioned that the county was suspicious someone had been dumping chemicals into the creek. Right as the deputy knelt down by the creek, sample vial in hand, I suddenly heard tires screeching in the distance. When I looked up, Karen was bolting straight across our property line, waving her phone in the air, eyes frantic. "I'm calling 911, she shouted from afar. At first, I figured it was just an empty threat, until I heard her frantic voice chattering into the speaker. My pulse quickened. What's she up to now? I muttered quietly to myself. The deputy raised an eyebrow, calmly capped his sample bottle, and stood upright. Seconds later, I heard Karen clearly announcing my address to the dispatcher. Then, without missing a beat, she shouted into her phone. "I need to report suspicious activity on my neighbor's farmland." That's when the deputy broke into a slow, amused grin. When Karen furiously jabbed her finger on the 911 keypad, disbelief swept over me. I felt like I'd stepped into some bizarre television drama. But this was no TV script. This was my actual life, and it kept getting stranger by the minute. Deputy Carter, still wearing his brown sheriff's uniform complete with badge, calmly approached Karen. He tucked the water sample securely under his arm and held an official-looking notepad. Karen was so absorbed in her anger that she didn't even notice him until he was practically right next to her. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Karen snapped, dismissively eyeing the deputy from head to toe. Calmly, he lifted his chin and replied, "Ma'am, I'm from the county sheriff's department. I overheard your report about suspicious activity." Karen blinked at him in stunned silence for just a moment. But, as expected, she quickly regained her composure. "Yes," she barked firmly. "I have good reason to believe my neighbor here is dumping waste illegally." She spat out the accusation as though my barn was secretly housing barrels of toxic sludge. Karen's face turned such a bright shade of red, I genuinely thought she'd burst a blood vessel. I stood back a few steps, just quietly taking in the unfolding scene. As strange as this whole thing was, I'll admit there was a certain satisfaction in seeing the deputy calmly standing there, arms crossed, letting her rant and rave. She kept going on and on about the compost odor, the donkey's noise, and how my orchard was ruining the neighborhood's perfect image. Honestly, she sounded like she was trying out for some comedic soap opera role. Midway through her tirade, another patrol car rolled up right at the edge of my property. The second deputy stepped out, a young rookie named Noah. I knew him because he'd come around once before, responding to another bogus complaint about supposed vagrants on my land. Another false alarm courtesy of none other than Karen. Deputy Nolan got out of the cruiser, briefly made eye contact with me, and gave me a subtle, friendly nod. Then he turned toward Karen, who stood defiantly with her arms folded over her chest. She launched into another complaint, dramatically pointing a finger my way. "My neighbor," she began, "is clearly breaking multiple sanitation codes, and I demand he be." At that moment, Deputy Carter cleared his throat loudly. "Ma'am," he interrupted politely but firmly, "we actually came today to investigate a completely different issue." He held up the sealed container of creek water. "We suspect someone has been dumping lawn chemicals into the creek, affecting irrigation systems at several farms. We have strong reasons to believe that the source of this runoff traces back to your property." Karen's mouth fell open, and for a second, I thought she might actually faint. "My property?" she squeaked. "Yes, ma'am," Deputy Carter continued patiently. "We received complaints from you and several others about potential hazards. But after examining drainage routes, we identified high concentrations of fertilizer matching exactly what your neighborhood uses on its landscape gardens." Karen's expression switched instantly from victorious to shocked. Her anger surged again as she desperately tried deflecting blame. "Now wait just a second," she snapped indignantly. Are you seriously accusing me, of all people, of polluting that creek? We have guidelines, very strict ones. I'll remind you. Deputy Nolan calmly stepped in. Ma'am, your HOA's landscaping standards, although stringent, do not override county environmental regulations. If you or your gardening service has been applying commercial fertilizers excessively and they've run off into the creek. He hesitated, flipping through pages of his notebook. That's a pretty serious violation. Karen's face went from beet red to ghostly pale. She stammered in disbelief. But, but he's letting goat manure wash into the creek, she argued desperately, pointing back toward me. He's got farm animals all over the place. Who knows what's in that water? That seemed like a good moment to speak up. I carefully explained how my father had built a filtration setup years ago to prevent any livestock waste from getting into the waterways. We'd upgraded it over the decades, adding natural buffer zones and vegetation. My goats and donkeys stayed nowhere near the creek, and even the compost heap was contained safely. The authorities had already given my property a quick inspection just the week before, and everything checked out fine. On the other hand, chemical runoff from the overly manicured lawns in her subdivision was a different story entirely. Deputy Carter handed Karen a business card from the county's environmental department. We'll need a formal statement from you, Miss Karen, he said diplomatically. It's quite possible you and your HOA weren't fully aware of the environmental impacts. But regardless, we do have evidence showing repeated contamination. Until everything's cleared up, you and your landscaping team must stop using chemicals near the creek. Karen blinked in disbelief, then quickly recovered, her tone filled with arrogance. I see exactly what's going on here, she announced. This is clearly some conspiracy between my neighbor and your sheriff's department, probably organized by local farmers or something. Well, I'm not going to stand for it. I pay taxes, till. Ignoring the absurdity of her rant, Deputy Nolan turned toward me. Sir, would you be willing to officially document the changes you've observed in the creek? I nodded in agreement. Of course. I've got notes detailing daily irrigation use and water quality test results going back a month. Photos, till. Karen shot me a nasty scowl. This is ridiculous. I'm calling my attorney. Actually, no. I'll call the HOA board first. They'll put an immediate stop to this nonsense. She was practically shaking with anger at this point. Just then, my wife Laura stepped out onto our porch. She glanced from Karen to the two deputies, then finally at me. Is everything okay out here? Laura asked, her voice calm, though her eyes showed clear curiosity. Laura had grown up here and seen practically every kind of drama that farm life could dish out. But even she'd never met someone like Karen, who seemed to think she could rewrite the rules to suit herself. Everything's fine, dear, I replied, trying to sound reassuring. Although Karen just decided to call 911 on us. Maura raised her eyebrows slightly, but she stayed perfectly composed. She politely smiled at Deputy Carter before turning back to Karen. Would you care to come inside for a glass of lemonade while we talk things over? Laura asked pleasantly. It might help everyone cool down. Karen sniffed disdainfully, turning her nose up as if the very idea of stepping into our farmhouse insulted her. Absolutely not, she snapped. I'm not setting foot inside that place. Right at that moment, a third vehicle, this one an unmarked black sedan, pulled smoothly into the gravel driveway. Out stepped Detective Grant, a seasoned county investigator specializing in environmental crimes. He'd come out today to cross-check our creek water samples against previous complaints. You could practically feel the tension spike as he slowly walked up. Karen still clutched her phone tightly, glaring at him as he approached. She looked exactly like a trapped cat ready to fight or flee. But little did she realize how deep she'd already dug herself into this hole. There was far more to her supposed pollution than she realized, and it was about to be exposed. What Karen didn't yet know was that the detective had already uncovered a suspicious paper trail of chemical purchases leading directly back to her property. Detective Grant wasted no time, nodding hello to Deputies Carter and Nolan. Then he politely tipped his hat to Laura and me with a courteous, "Ma'am, sir." Finally, he turned his steady gaze to Karen, who stood rigidly with her arms folded, defiant to the bitter end. The tension hung heavy, and for just a moment, all you could hear were the rustling orchard leaves and a rooster crowing off in the distance. Karen was the first one to break the heavy silence. Are you here investigating my neighbor's environmental infractions too? Because if that's the case, I've got plenty of evidence. Her words came out sharp as knives, dripping with self-righteous anger. Detective Grant responded with a polite but carefully reserved smile. I'm here to look into environmental violations, that's true. He glanced down at the sleek, leather-bound folder he was holding, flipping slowly through a couple of pages. Specifically, the repeated runoff of prohibited chemicals into county waterways. These chemicals have already been traced back to purchase orders authorized by the Stonefield Meadows HOA. He paused deliberately, giving Karen a meaningful look. And your signature appears on several of these documents, Miss Karen. The color immediately drained from her face. That's completely ridiculous, she sputtered. Sure, I sign lots of things for the HOA, landscaping budgets, flowerbed expansions, but never anything against the law. Detective Grant gave a patient nod. I understand your position. However, we've spoken with your landscaper, Mr. Wallace. He informed us that the HOA explicitly instructed him to apply fertilizers and pesticides in higher amounts than local ordinances permit. We strongly believe these chemicals have found their way into the creek. When Wallace's name came up, Karen's mouth instantly tightened. Wallace himself had once privately confessed to me how Karen relentlessly pressured him into overplanting roses, hydrangeas, and exotic blooms. Anything, really, to make their community entrance resemble some kind of fancy garden exhibit. A few months earlier, he'd vented to me about Karen's unreasonable demands for extra chemical treatments. She wants the biggest, brightest, most attention-grabbing flowers in the county, each side, clearly set up. I'd warned him at the time that overusing chemicals could harm the local environment, but he shrugged helplessly, admitting he couldn't risk losing the job. Clearly, that past conversation was now coming back around to haunt Karen. Her voice trembled slightly as she snapped back. Wallace is a liar. He's just trying to cover up his own incompetence. I had no knowledge of any illegal chemicals. This is entirely his fault. She sounded panicked, like someone caught sinking into quicksand and realizing nobody was reaching out to help her. Deputy Carter gently interrupted her protests. Ma'am, at this stage, it might be best for you to give an official statement at the station, along with any documentation you have to back up your claims. However, right now, we need to talk about your 911 call. Dispatch mentioned that you claimed your neighbor was actively committing a crime. Clearly, that's not what's happening here. Karen narrowed her eyes defensively. I have every right to call 911 if I believe a crime is being committed, she snapped, shooting another spiteful look my way. His donkey was making a racket. In that compost heap, who knows what's hidden in there? I couldn't help rolling my eyes slightly. Complaining about a noisy donkey was one thing, but hinting that our compost contained something sinister? That was pure Karen, desperately grasping at straws. She knew she was losing ground, so she threw out any accusation that popped into her head, hoping one might stick. Detective Grant let out a careful sigh before turning toward me. Sue, would you like to press charges against her for misusing 911 or for harassment? I paused a moment, weighing the potential consequences. On one hand, Karen's antics had moved beyond irritating. They were approaching harassment. But on the other hand, she was already facing a potentially serious environmental investigation. And truthfully, I wasn't after revenge. I just wanted peace and quiet. Let's wait and see how things develop, I replied carefully. I'd rather not escalate anything if we can sort it out properly. Karen let out an incredulous scoff. Resolution? The only resolution I'll accept is you finally complying with our community standards. We can't have outsiders blatantly ignoring regulations. It's unfair to all of us who follow the rules and pay our dues. Nira, who quietly observed from the porch steps, finally couldn't keep silent any longer. Ma'am, she began firmly, this land has been ours for decades. We're not part of your HOA, and your rules simply don't apply to us. And quite frankly, she added calmly, standing up straight, we wouldn't join your HOA if you offered us all the tea in China. She said it politely, but firmly enough. My father-in-law hadn't raised Laura to let anyone push her around. A flicker of uncertainty flashed across Karen's face, like she'd suddenly realized no amount of protesting could force us into her HOA rules. That momentary understanding of the futility in her demands seemed to shake her confidence. But Karen being Karen, she wasn't willing to concede entirely. Don't you people care at all about property values? She snapped bitterly. Allowing farm animals to roam everywhere. Painting your barn that awful color. You should be astounded. Ah yes, the barn. It was an old structure, first painted a cheerful golden hue by my grandfather sometime back in the 70s. Over the decades, it had faded into a curious yet endearing shade we affectionately called harvest gold. Sure, it didn't blend perfectly into the subdivision's approved muted earth tone palette, but it had its own charm. Naturally, Karen despised it. Detective Grant glanced at Laura, then me, his brow knitted slightly in sympathy for our situation. Miss Karen, he began carefully, clearing his throat, let's refocus on the current issue, which is the environmental contamination. This farm has documentation proving they're not responsible for pollution. However, the county has clear records showing your HOA is indeed responsible. I'm here today to issue a formal citation on behalf of the Department of Environmental Conservation. We'll also require your official statement. Just then, Karen's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced quickly at the screen and turned away from us, quietly muttering curses under her breath. I overheard something about the HOA board. Maybe they'd found out about the investigation and were calling her in a panic. Meanwhile, Detective Grant and I walked over to the creek, to the spot where Deputy Carter had collected the water sample. As we passed through the orchard, sunlight filtered through the apple trees, warming the late morning air. I'm truly sorry you're having to deal with all this nonsense, Grant said quietly. Clearly, you've done everything by the book. I nodded in appreciation. My father taught me two important things, how to work this land and how to respect it. He never believed in taking shortcuts, especially not where the environment was concerned. Karen, though maybe her obsession with a perfect lawn led her astray. Grant smirked knowingly. Pursuing perfection in landscaping can turn into a dangerous game, he said thoughtfully. Then his voice grew serious again. We suspect the contamination issue is substantial enough to result in fines for the HOA. We're talking potentially thousands of dollars in penalties if it goes to court. And if they drag their feet, it might even escalate into criminal charges against whoever authorized the excessive chemical usage. As we approached the creek, Laura came over to join us, handing me a neatly organized binder filled with water testing records. She smiled warmly at Detective Grant. Here's the data from the past month, she said. We've been carefully tracking everything, any noticeable residues, changes in odor, and shifts in pH levels. The log spoke clearly to the farm's meticulous care and, ironically, directly contradicted Karen's endless accusations. Meanwhile, back near the patrol cars, Karen was having a loud, heated conversation on her phone. Now, I'm not just going to roll over and take this. Yes, I know exactly what they're accusing me of. We have to fight back. She paced furiously, occasionally shooting glares in our direction. Deputy Nolan glanced over at her, then turned to us. She sure is digging herself quite a hole, calling 911 and bringing out half the sheriff's department. Now we've even got Detective Grant here. Usually, it takes weeks before an environmental case gets an investigator on site. But thanks to Karen's call, he's already here. Quite a twist of fate, isn't it? I shrugged lightly. Yeah, it's pretty ironic, but maybe it's better this way. Now maybe we can finally get everything settled once and for all. Laura placed a reassuring hand on my arm. Let's just see this through calmly, she murmured softly. We'll answer their questions, provide our logs, and keep our dignity. Right at that moment, Karen ended her call and stormed toward us. You'll pay for this, she hissed, stabbing a shaking finger in my direction. I don't know how, But mark my words, you will. This is harassment, and I'm definitely filing a lawsuit. Her voice echoed sharply across the orchard, almost like a bad omen. Detective Grant quietly closed his folder, calmly meeting her angry gaze. Ma'am, you're certainly within your rights to contact an attorney. But remember, you were the one who called 911 against your neighbor today. We're here solely because you requested law enforcement presence. What you didn't realize was that we were already on site investigating an environmental matter, one pointing directly at you. For just a brief second, Karen's face twisted as she realized that her righteous campaign had spectacularly backfired. She was like the fish that eagerly jumped onto the hook. We didn't yet know exactly how this would end, but one thing seemed crystal clear. Karen's meltdown wasn't over yet. By the time noon rolled around, the day had turned into something downright surreal. I'd woken up that morning expecting nothing more than a routine creek water inspection. Instead, I'd gotten front row seats to Karen's epic collapse, complete with half the sheriff's department and an environmental crimes detective. Karen had retreated to her driveway, tapping angrily on her phone, no doubt alerting the HOA board, her lawyer, and maybe even her cousin Tommy down in Texas, just for moral support. Meanwhile, Laura, Detective Grant, and I stood gathered on our wraparound porch, sipping cold lemonade. Deputy Nolan leaned casually against a porch column, arms crossed, watching Karen pace back and forth, phone pressed urgently to her ear like it was her lifeline. Eventually, Karen marched defiantly back toward the house, her face grimly determined. I just spoke to the HOA president, she announced sharply. He's coming here now, and once he arrives, we'll settle this nonsense. Detective Grant simply nodded, his expression calm but resolute. Fine by me. I've got time. He didn't look at all worried about the HOA president showing up. After all, he already had ample evidence. The main question now was whether Karen's signature on the purchase orders was genuine and if the HOA had any plausible deniability. Nearly 10 minutes later, a polished black SUV barreled down the road, gravel scattering as it swung quickly into Karen's driveway. A middle-aged man stepped out wearing a neatly pressed polo shirt, complete with the HOA logo embroidered on the front. He introduced himself formally as Michael Hargrove, current president of the Stonefield Meadows Homeowners Association. Karen immediately rushed over to him like a hungry cat pouncing on prey. Michael, these people, she waved her arms dramatically toward Laura, me, and the deputies. They're accusing me of contaminating the creek. Me. Can you even believe it? She said, practically shouting with indignation. We have to put a stop to this madness immediately. Michael's eyes shifted uneasily from Karen to Detective Grant. Karen, just calm down, he urged gently. Let's hear what they have to say first. Clearly, he'd been caught off guard by all the drama unfolding in front of him. His eyes met mine briefly, and I gave him a polite nod. Detective Grant stepped forward and introduced himself, laying out the situation clearly and calmly. Mr. Hargrove, we have documentation of substantial fertilizer and pesticide orders made under your HOA's authority, significantly surpassing the state's allowable limits. We have strong reason to believe these chemicals are seeping into this creek, constituting a clear environmental violation. Ms. Karen's signature is on several of these orders, particularly those exceeding recommended amounts. Michael's expression became deeply troubled. Taryn, is this true? She flung her hands upward defensively. Maybe I signed some forms, but I didn't scrutinize every detail. And Wallace is the one who actually applied everything. We just wanted the landscaping to live up to subdivision standards. Michael rubbed the bridge of his nose tiredly. Karen, we have specific protocols in place for this kind of thing. We always check with county guidelines first. Did you ignore those steps? Her jaw tightened stubbornly. Maybe I sped things up a little because the board insisted the flower beds looked absolutely perfect for the annual property tour. We couldn't risk a mediocre display. You know how important it is for property values. Detective Grant calmly pulled an invoice from his folder, handing it over to Michael. Here's the purchase order clearly indicating quantity. We've confirmed most of these chemicals were used along the property line near the creek. We'll also investigate whether Ms. Karen ordered additional chemicals specifically for her own personal property. Karen's lips parted in stunned indignation. How dare you imply my personal yard has nothing to do with this? She stopped short abruptly, realizing just how suspicious her outburst sounded. Quickly pressing her lips together, she remained silent. Michael scanned over the invoice, his face rapidly losing color. Karen, this is triple R approved landscaping allowance. Did you really authorize this? Karen's voice broke slightly. You said the annual tour required us to go above and beyond. I was only trying to help. She glanced anxiously from Michael to me and finally to Detective Grant, seemingly searching for even a tiny bit of sympathy. She found none. Michael sighed deeply, then turned to Detective Grant. We'll cooperate fully. If our HOA is responsible, we'll accept the fines and immediately rectify the issue. But please realize, he added solemnly, most of us had absolutely no idea this was happening. He looked at Karen, visibly disappointed. We entrust certain decisions to committee heads, but we certainly don't expect them to disregard legal regulations. Detective Grant nodded thoughtfully. I understand. Nonetheless, Ms. Karen still needs to provide an official statement regarding your involvement. And if the county chooses to pursue charges, Detective Grant continued, the board itself could face allegations of negligence. That's when Karen finally snapped. This is all your fault. She spat bitterly, turning sharply toward me. If you'd simply joined the HOA from the beginning, we could have avoided all this drama. Her reasoning made absolutely no sense, but I could tell she was desperate. Your dirty animals and that outdated barn are a complete eyesore, she went on. You pushed me into doing this. You turned our beautiful community into some kind of ridiculous farm disaster. Laura's eyes narrowed sharply. That's enough, Karen, she said, her tone steady but firm. We've tolerated your constant harassment for months. My husband has gone out of his way to be neighborly. He offered you tours, explained exactly how our eco-friendly compost system works, even showed you firsthand the measures we've taken to protect the creek. But you refused to listen. And now look where your stubbornness has led you. Karen let out a bitter laugh, tears welling in her eyes. You think you're both so superior with your precious orchard and your noisy donkey. But guess what? The HO won't ever stop trying to raise this area up to proper standards. Detective Grant stepped forward, voice calm yet firm. Ms. Karen, continued harassment of your neighbors is a separate issue, one that can also be addressed legally. At this moment, our focus remains on potential environmental violations. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have no choice but to bring you downtown for questioning. At those words, Karen's bravado finally shattered. Her shoulders sagged, and she dropped her gaze. Fine, she mumbled quietly, swallowing her pride. I'll cooperate, but I'm not admitting to anything. This entire situation is one huge misunderstanding. Tears glistened at the edges of her eyes, but she stubbornly blinked them back. Michael gently placed a hand on her shoulder, more as a conciliatory gesture than sincere comfort. Let's go talk things over with Detective Grant, he said softly, guiding her toward the unmarked sedan. Deputies Nolan and Carter lingered behind, wrapping up some final paperwork with Laura and me. We'll make sure we file the report about Karen's 911 call, Deputy Nolan said. Considering all that happened, would you like to push for a fine regarding misuse of emergency services? I glanced at Laura, who subtly shook her head. Not right now, I answered quietly. We really just want peace, and for the creek to stay protected. That was what mattered most. Deep down, I wondered if true peace was even possible with Karen as our neighbor. But for now, I'd happily settle for her being too preoccupied defending herself to bother us further. Before leaving, Detective Grant handed me his card. If there's any additional trouble, he told me, call me directly. He turned toward Karen, who stood silently beside Michael. Miss Karen, let's head down to the station now. We'll take your formal statement, and afterward, the county will decide how best to proceed. Karen shot one final, searing glare in my direction. I could practically feel her hatred radiating, Yet she remained silent. Instead, she quietly climbed into the back seat of the unmarked car. The door shut firmly behind her with a decisive click. I released a breath I hadn't even realized I'd been holding. The gentle rustling of orchard leaves felt comforting, a reminder that real life here on the farm would continue, despite all Karen's drama. Laura squeezed my hand softly, and for a moment we stood there quietly, absorbing the full weight of everything that had just happened. Deputy Carter gave me a reassuring nod. "Take care, folks," he said, tipping his hat politely. "We'll be in touch." Deputy Nolan waved goodbye, and soon both patrol cars pulled away. Michael's shiny black SUV was next, leaving the property quietly. Finally, Detective Grant's sedan rolled down the driveway, kicking up a small trail of dust beneath the afternoon sun. And suddenly, there was silence. Beautiful, peaceful country silence, interrupted only by Peanut the donkey braying off in the distance. Laura and I walked slowly back toward the porch. She gave my arm another gentle squeeze, smiling softly. "You know," she said warmly, "your father would have been proud of how we handled ourselves today. We stood our ground, honored our principles, and protected this farm just like he taught us." I smiled, looking out over the orchard my grandfather had planted, the fields my dad had worked tirelessly, and the old barn in its glorious, weathered harvest gold color. Karen actually called 911 on us. I murmured a disbelief, shaking my head gently. Turns out, the police were already on her trail. Guess life has its own way of evening things out. Maura laughed quietly, her eyes twinkling. "It sure does. Now, how about we go find out what's got Peanut so worked up?" We headed toward the barn together, hand in hand. Peanut let out another enthusiastic hee-haw as we approached, and a couple of curious goats peeked out from their pen, clearly wondering what all the earlier commotion was about. Everything finally felt right again in our little corner of the world. Sure, Karen might still be next door, stewing over the chaos she created, but at least for today, the farm stood proud and free. No matter how many fancy gardens or regulations the HOA tried to push, this land was ours, and it wasn't going anywhere.